Tov. Today's Daf Yomi is Gittin Ayin Test, Gittin 79, and we're going to start with today's Daf Yomi on the top of 79a. So the Mishnah tells us on Ayin Test and Aleph, so Medes Arosh Agag. Let's say the woman is standing on the rooftop, the Zarkua, and then the husband throws to her the get. Kivin Shehigia. Once the get reaches La'avir Hagag, the airspace of the roof, Harezom Megureshes, we're going to say she's divorced at that point. Once the get reaches her airspace, it's as though it's in her domain, and then she's divorced. But let's say Hu Milamala, the Himilamata, let's say he's on the rooftop and she's below in the courtyard, Verzarkula, and then he throws her the get, Kivin Sheyad Samirshis Hagag. Once it leaves his domain, and then thereby it's in her airspace, then nimchak or nisraf, then even if it's erased or burnt before it rests, harezum gureshes, we're going to consider as though it's in her domain and she's divorced. Mar first asked the question, how could he throw the get into her domain and then she's divorced? Mintar. But at that point, the get is not being guarded or protected. So Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. So Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, Begag sheyeshlo ma'aka. So we're talking about a case where, meaning to say, if he throws the get's going to be flown away by the wind. So who cares if it's in the airspace? So how is it going to work? So it's not being protected. So Shmuel's position is, as says Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, we're talking about a roof with a fence around it that protects the get from flying away. Gag sheyeshlo ma'aka askina. Ula bar Menashe Mishmei Davimi says, no. What we're talking about here is b'pachos mishlosha samuch. Here what we're talking about is that the get falls within 3 tefachim of the floor of the roof. And so therefore it's on the floor. So it's like it's on the floor. And we have a concept. They're called the pachos mishlosha samuch l'gag k'gag dami. Anything that's within 3 tefachim of the floor of the roof is like it's on the roof. And this is basically the concept of lavud, that within 3 tefachim of the ground, it's like it's on the ground. So now the Gemara says, if he's above and she's below, if he throws it down, it's going to be, she's divorced. The Gemara says, well, minter, but in this case, the get is not being protected or watched. So Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel could go on. So we don't give the same answers we gave before. Instead, the Gemara gives different answers. So it says Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel could go on Shei Machitzos HaTachtonos Odfos Al Yonos. So what we're talking about here is that the outer walls of the courtyard rise up above the top walls of the roof. And so therefore they go above the fence. And so therefore the second it leaves the roof is in the airspace of the outer courtyard. And so therefore it's going to be like it's in its area. And so too, Ua says the same thing. So the second it leaves the airspace of the roof, it's in the courtyard itself. And this must be like the position of Rebbe, who says that if it's kluta, that this must be like the position of Rebbe, who says kluta, that if it's going through the air, it's as though it was placed on the ground. So since it was going through the airspace, it's as though it's placed on the ground, and therefore she's divorced. Must be like the position of Rebbe. Rebbe argues with respect to Shabbos with the Chachamim. If you throw something from one public domain to another public domain and it travels through a private domain, since it's just only going through the air, is it like it's placed on the ground? Rebbe says it is, and Rabbanan say it's not. So our Mishnah must be like Rebbe, who says that basically as long as it's in the airspace, it's like it's placed on the ground. So that's what Rabbi Abba says to Ula. So Ula responds, no, I feel it Rabbanan. No, and our Mishnah can even be like the Rabbanan. How can it be like the Rabbanan? How is that even possible? He explains it how it's possible. I can't put the Rabbanan away the Rabbi Elinian Shabbos. When did the Rabbanan argue with respect to Rabbi only about Shabbos? There we say that the Rabbanan say if it goes through the airspace, it's not like it's placed on the ground. But here the whole purpose of the get, it has to be in something that's protected, that's guarded. And so here, if it's in the courtyard, it's guarded. We have the same statement repeated. Yochanan says that the outer walls rise above the upper walls of the roof. And do we say it's like Rabbi? No. So it's the same exact restatement. So if it was erased, you threw it into the courtyard, and it was, even though it was erased, we're going to say she's divorced. So it says that's only if it was erased on its way down, to the courtyard. But if it was erased while it's still on its way up, you threw it off the roof, you threw it up, and then it became erased, then we're not going to say it's a valid get. Why? My time of because from the outset, it wasn't able to be placed down, because before it started in its downward motion, in which case it would apply the principle of kluta, it was already erased. So therefore, we're not going to say it's effective. Nisraf, let's say the get was burnt, but the get was burnt when you threw it into the courtyard before it landed, she's still going to be divorced. That's only where the get came before the fire. Meaning to say that you threw the get into the courtyard before the fire started in the airspace of the courtyard. But if the fire happened before the get, then we're not going to say it's divorced. Well, by time Meikara was Sreifa Ka'azil. Because from the outset, we're going to say that the get was never meant to be landing on the ground, it was meant to be burnt. And so therefore it's not going to be a valid get. There's this concept called different domains, and we apply that to the principle of Gittin, of divorce. So let's see what Rashi says here. He explains what this means. Let's say if let's say the husband says to the wife, I'm going to give you a space in my courtyard to receive the get. He won't give her two spaces. He'll give her only one space. And we won't say that he doesn't care, because the husband's not going to give her two spaces. He's saying he only gives her one space. If you give somebody a space, you're giving them one space. You're not giving them two spaces. They shouldn't take two spaces. So it says, Rav Chisda, Rishuyos Chalukos Begitin. Amalei Rami Barachamo Rava Minale Saba. How does Saba know this principle that by Gittin you're giving them one space and not two? So he says, Amalei Masnisan he. It's our Mishnah. So Medis Arosh Agag. Let's say she's standing on the roof. Vizarkula, and he throws her the get. Even Shegia get Avir Agag, once it reaches the airspace of the roof, Arezim Megareshes. She's divorced. But what are we talking about here? But Mayaskina, and what's the scenario? If it's her roof and her courtyard, then Lamali Avir Agag. Why do we need the airspace of the roof? It must be Begag Didei, V'Chatzer Didei. It must, meaning, say, if it was her courtyard, then she's already divorced before it even gets to the roof. The roof is inside the courtyard. So it must be we're talking about it's his roof and his courtyard. That can't be. Even if it gets to the airspace of the roof, what's the matter? Because there's nothing going on because it's still his space. Now, Pshita must be for sure, it must be then it's her roof and his courtyard. But Ema Seifu. But what about the conclusion? Ema Seifa, the concluding clause. If he's above and she's below. Vizarku, and he threw it to her. Given Shiyasim Rishus Agag, once it cleaves the domain, we're going to say of the roof, Nimchak or Nisraf, even if it's a raise or divorce, the raise of Megureshes. She's divorced. But if you wanted to say V'ibigag Didav Achatzer Didei, if you want to say it was her roof and his courtyard, Amai Megureshes, why is she divorced? It's going into his courtyard. So it must be Al Begag Didei V'Chatzer Didei. So it must be the husband owns everything. He owns the roof and he owns the courtyard. And Reisha Begag Dida V'Chatzer. So it must be, it must be in the concluding clause that it's his roof and her courtyard. But that we don't want to say either, says the Gemara, because Reisha Begagdi Da v'Chatzar Didei, Seifa Begagdi Dei v'Chatzar Dida. Why would you assume that there are opposite scenarios, and in the first clause it's her roof and the second clause it's his roof? Usually the Mishnah would talk about the same mukim, to the same scenario in both cases. Elav, so it must be that what's the answer to Ushla? It's really all the husbands. Makom dechad, the Ushla makom dechad makom. Mushli and she trei makomos momentarily. It must be that he lent her the space, and each case he's giving her the space where she's standing, but you only give her one space and not two spaces. That must be the scenario. So therefore, we see Rishuyos Chalukos Begittin, that the husband gives only one space by a get. The Gemara says, no, that's not what we want to say. The Gemara says, Amalei Midi Yiria, is that necessarily the case? That's all you have to say. Dilma Hakadisa Rakadisa. It must be two separate scenarios in our Mishnah. Reisha Begagi Da v'Chatzar Didei, Seifa Begagi Dei v'Chatzar Dida. The first clause is her roof and his courtyard. The second clause is his roof and her courtyard. Amarav al Shalosh Midos Begittin. There are three laws of Gittin, and where Gittin is arguing with the laws of Shabbos. That's what it means here. The first is Hada Amar Rebbe Kuta Kamishon. That fact where the case where you throw a ball, let's say, from a public domain to another public domain, and it passes through the private domain, and Rebbe says it's like it was placed on the ground and you'd be liable on Shabbos, and Paul and the rabbis arguing, say you're not liable. Animal Shabbos, that's only with respect to Shabbos. But with respect to a get, even the Rabbanon would say that it's a get if it goes through the airspace because Mishum Tureyu, because it just needs to be guarded. And this going through the airspace of the woman is considered guarded. And number two is Vahada Amar Rav Chisda. And the second thing is that which Rav Chisda taught in Meseches Shabbos, Dav Zayin at the very beginning. No, it's Kana Bereshus HaYachid. Let's say you place a pole in the private domain, Uberosho Trosco, and on top of it has a big sack, Vizarak V'nach Al Gabav, and then you threw something and it landed on this pole, on the sack. I feel Gavoa Meya Amar, meaning to say that you have a private domain and you throw something from the public domain into the private domain, but you have put a pole in the private domain. The pole is very, very high. It's 150 feet, 100 amos. You're still going to be liable. We're going to say that you threw it onto the private domain, even though it's very high. Because the private domain keeps going up forever. Unlike Rishus Harabim, Rashi says, which only goes up to 10 tefachim. Or Rashi says, the public domain is not above 10, but the Rishus HaYachid goes up forever. And so therefore, under this scenario, we're going to say that this is going to be the case. But when it comes to the private domain, hold on one second. When it comes to the private domain, then we're going to say that it goes up forever. And so that's the halacha as it relates to Shabbos. Hold on one second. Okay, and then, however, with respect to a get, it's not going to be a get. With respect to a get, if you throw the get onto a very, very high pole, for sure the wind is going to throw it away, and it's not going to be considered a get. The third thing is also halacha as it relates to Shabbos. I'm talking about Tessim base. That person can't stand on one roof and take it from one rooftop to the other rooftop, some water, because as we say with respect to Shabbos, you're not allowed to carry from one private domain to another private domain, because unless you have an Eruv to allow you to carry, you can't carry from somebody's courtyard to another's courtyard. But that is not only the case in the courtyard, but it's also the case on the rooftops. You can't take something from one person's rooftop to the other person's rooftop, because just like they are considered two separate residences below, so two above. But Ani Miling and Shabbos, that's only as relates to the laws of Shabbos. Avoiding in Gittin, but with respect to a get, Mishum Kpedu, it's not a question of carrying from one domain to the other. It's a question of, does the owner of this roof mind if the woman receives the get there? The kuliyai will kapti inchi, and people won't care if you move from one roof to the other because people don't. Although they use their roofs, they didn't use them that much that they minded if you went and collected the get over there, and so the person would have rented out. So Amar Abaye shtei chatzeros zu ufnei mizu. So Abaye says if you have two courtyards, one's inside the other, pnimis shela the inner one belongs to her. V'chitzona shelo, but the outer courtyard belongs to him. V'chitzos achitzonos odfos ala pnimios, and the outer courtyards are taller than the inner ones. V'zarkua, and then he throws her the get. The walls of the outer courtyards are taller than the walls of the inner ones. And then he throws her the get, kivin shegia la'avir mechitzos achitzona. Once it reaches the airspace of the outer courtyard, kivin shegia la'avir mechitzos achitzona harezum migureshes. Once it reaches the airspace of the outer courtyard, we're going to say she's going to be divorced under those circumstances. Meaning to say, once it reaches the airspace, then we're going to say, under those circumstances, even though it didn't come into the walls of the courtyard, so she's in the inner courtyard, the husband's in the outer courtyard, and once he reaches and he throws the get into her courtyard, once it reaches the airspace of her courtyard, even though it didn't really come into the walls of her courtyard, it's just in the airspace, so it's above it, and the only way it's being protected is through the outer walls. Nevertheless, we're going to say Harezum Megurasha, she's going to be divorced. My time, Panimis Kufa, the Mechitzas Achitzona come into her, because since the inner courtyard was always being protected by the walls of the outer courtyard, therefore we review those walls of the outer courtyard as though they're the walls of the inner courtyard. And also with respect to acquiring the get, we're going to say it's considered like the airspace of the inner courtyard, and so therefore she's going to be divorced. Masha'en came bekupos. This is not going to be the same halacha as it relates to the utensils. Let's say you have shtei kupos, two utensils, let's say two baskets, zubitol, one inside the other, and panimis shala, the inner courtyard, the inner basket is hers, the achitzona shalom, the outer basket is his. Usurakolo, and the husband throws the get into her basket, afilu gila avir, panimis aina megreshes. Even though she reaches the airspace of the inner one, she's not divorced until it comes into the actual basket itself. My time, because the get has not yet fallen onto the floor of the utensil. And since the utensil is only really made to put something in and not to have the chitzos, not to have walls to guard the airspace, therefore the airspace of the utensil does not acquire anything until it rests on the ground. The Gemara says, but let's just ask a tangential question, says the Gemara. What do we care if it rests on the ground? It's still going to be considered like the utensils of the purchaser in the domain of the seller, meaning to say if her basket is on his basket, then it's like her basket is resting in his domain. So maybe we can answer this question, which we had before, that maybe you can acquire something if you have your utensil in somebody else's domain. No, the Gemara says, no, that's not necessarily the ukimti here that her utensils and is resting on his utensil, because it's possible that the baskets have no floors, and so therefore her basket is not resting into his basket. Now after the next Mishnah, Beis Shammai says, Poter Adam Ishto B'get Yashan. Beis Shammai says a man can divorce his wife with an older get, meaning to say, what's an older get? He writes the get for her, and then he's secluded with her, and he doesn't divorce her till much later. Beis Shammai says it's still a valid get. Beisil osrin. Beisil prohibits that. Beisu get yashan. What's considered an older get? Anytime he's secluded with her after he writes the get, but he doesn't give it to her right away, and then he spends the night secluded with her, he spends some time secluded with her, it's going to be considered like, under those circumstances, it's going to be considered, it's a get Yasham Beisol prohibits it. So Gemara says, okay, what's Beis Shammai and Beisol arguing about? Beis Shammai says, Lo Amrin and Gezerah Shemer Yu Amru Gita Kodam Avna. Beis Shammai says, we're not concerned that people will look at the date, and then let's say she'll have a child after the date on the get is written because she's secluded with her husband. And people say, oh, the get came before the son, and this child was born out of wedlock. Whereas Beisol Savri Amrin and Gezerah Shemer Yu Amru Gita Kodam Avna. Beisol say no. You have to be concerned about that. Now, the child wouldn't be a mamzer under these circumstances, but Rashi says that the child would have what's called a pagam. That would be v'ave pagam, would be a defect. People wouldn't want to marry such a child. Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Shmuel, in these says, lo say that if she would get married, even according to Beis Hillel, if she would get married based upon the fact that she was divorced with a get yashan, she's allowed to remain married to the second husband. In this garsha, if she got divorced with it, she can even get married. According to the first approach of Rabbi Abba Shmuel, she can't get married to a second man. But according to the second approach, once she got divorced, she can even get married to. Says the Mishnah, let's say he writes this in the get, he writes a date. If he's living in Babylon and he writes a get for a kingdom that She'ena Hogenes, the Gemara is going to tell us what that kingdom is. If that's Rome, and we'll learn why Rome is called an inappropriate kingdom, or Shemalchus Madai, or Shemalchus Yavan, or Binyan Beis Chorban, or he writes it for Madai, Medea, or Greece. He writes the wrong, basically, kingdom in the get. Or he writes the get according to the number of years of Binyan Abayis of the temple, or L'chorban Abayis, or since the temple was destroyed. In all these cases, the get is disqualified because it wasn't written according to the way the rabbis instituted, according to the years of the kingdom that you're living in. And the Gemara is going to talk about why that has to be the case, why you're supposed to write it like that. Well, no, we'll stop the recording here. We can go on in person. We'll stop the recording here so that we can start from here for tomorrow's daf.